Dr. Anastasia Scott with the Georgia Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the Georgia Historical Society's Research Center here in Savannah. Each year, the Georgia Historical Society presents the Georgia History Festival, a series of programs and educational opportunities that allow students of all ages to explore the rich history of our state. Throughout the Georgia History Festival, we focus on a theme to inspire our programs and school activities. This year, we are looking at the critical and controversial period from the end of the Civil War through the early years of the 20th century. Our theme is the promise of a more perfect union, Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. Throughout the festival, we've been exploring how this pivotal period affected our state and nation and laid the foundation for many of the changes that came in the 20th century. To tell us more about some of the important events and people during the critical period we'll be studying through this year's theme, the promise of a more perfect union, Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, I will be joined by the Georgia Historical Society's senior historian, Dr. Stan Deaton.
The period known as Reconstruction began immediately following the close of the Civil War. It was the effort to bring the states of the former Confederacy and 4 million newly freed people into the political, social, and economic life of the United States. The Civil War ended slavery, but it left open the question as to whether the freed men and women would be citizens of this country. Did ending slavery mean simply freeing those in bondage? Reconstruction raised the great question, what is next for the formerly enslaved African Americans? Landholding, education, civil rights, voting, holding office, or only work and advancement through industry? African Americans made great political gains in the early years of Reconstruction, particularly through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These Reconstruction amendments laid the foundation for this important moment of American rebirth. Each did something profound. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th granted citizenship, and the 15th enshrined voting rights. And each addressed the two pivotal issues of the post-war period, the abolition of slavery and the integration of African Americans into the nation as free and independent people. After U.S. General William Sherman captured Savannah in December 1864, he and U.S. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met with 20 black leaders in Savannah at what is now the Green Meldrum House. Out of this meeting came Special Field Order 15. The order confiscated a strip of coastline stretching from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida, including Georgia's Sea Islands and the mainland 30 miles in from the coast. The order redistributed the roughly 400,000 acres of land to newly freed black families. The promise of a more perfect union in that moment was real. Congress set up the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865 in part to help with land claims and black resettlement in the territory reserved through Sherman's orders. But Field Order 15 turned out to be an empty promise. President Andrew Johnson overturned Sherman's directive in the fall of 1865 and returned most of the land along the coast to the white planters who had previously owned it. And so, like Special Field Order 15, many of the great gains achieved in the early years of this period were met by strong resistance in the years that followed. Jim Crow laws, Confederate monuments, sharecropping, the convict lease system, textbooks that supported the lost cause, lynching, the Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, all combined to limit the impact of the Reconstruction Amendments and led to the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans in states across the South. The loss of political and civil rights led African Americans to emphasize economic self-reliance and black leadership through entrepreneurs like Alonzo Herndon and bridge builders Horace and Washington King, through writers and journalists like W.E.B. Du Bois, Robert Singstack Abbott, and Ida Wells Barnett, and through organizations like the NAACP that promoted black uplift and laid the foundations for the great civil rights revolutions to come later in the 20th century. The promise of freedom for African Americans in the years after the Civil War was best represented in Georgia by Tunis Campbell. Though born free in New Jersey, he eventually became the highest-ranking and most influential African American politician in 19th century Georgia. Campbell was educated at an all-white academy in New York and joined the abolitionist movement in the years before the Civil War. In 1863, U.S. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton sent Campbell to Port Royal, South Carolina, to assist the U.S. Army in resettling former slaves. It was the beginning of a new life. Congress set up the Freedmen's Bureau in March 1865. Tunis Campbell was appointed to supervise land claims and black resettlement on 5 Georgia Sea islands, including Ossabaw, St. Catharines, and Sapelo, in keeping with General Sherman's Special Field Order 15, issued in Savannah several months earlier. Sherman's orders had confiscated land along the southeastern coast to be redistributed to newly freed black families. But Field Order 15 turned out to be an empty promise. President Andrew Johnson overturned Sherman's directive in the fall of 1865 and returned most of the land along the coast to the white planters who had previously owned it. But Campbell pushed on. As a black political leader, he had no equal. He purchased more than 1,200 acres in McIntosh County, established an association of black landowners, and built an unprecedented political base in coastal Georgia that protected freedmen from white backlash. He served in the state legislature until the end of Reconstruction, despite threats and physical violence. Despite the promise of freedom, once white conservatives regained state power in 1871, they pushed to overturn the gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction. Campbell lost his political power, and he became a target of white revenge. In 1876, Campbell was tried and convicted of malfeasance in office and spent a year in a convict labor camp. With Reconstruction over, the commitment to black political freedom seemed to be hanging in the balance. The backlash against the promise of freedom continued through the last years of the 19th century. By the 1890s, black Americans faced widespread disenfranchisement through Jim Crow laws, while the rise of Confederate monuments, the lost cause, and widespread lynchings all reinforced the notion that while slavery may have ended, white supremacy had not. The promise of a more perfect union was in peril. In the years following the Civil War, Atlanta civic leaders wanted to promote Georgia's post-Civil War economic development and showcase Atlanta as the resurgent heart of the New South. Atlanta's leaders hosted a series of 3 cotton expositions that were important to the city's recovery and economic development. The great promoter of the first 2 expositions was newspaperman Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution, one of the framers of a new vision for the South and its economy. The first 2 expositions in 1881 and 1887 were only marginally successful. The Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition that opened on September 18, 1895, however, was much grander. The goal was to foster trade between the southern states and South American nations and to show the products and facilities of the region to the rest of the nation and to Europe. 800,000 people visited the 6,000 exhibits over 3 months, including special buildings that featured the accomplishments of women and African Americans. On opening day, black educator Booker T. Washington delivered his controversial Atlanta Compromise speech. He urged fellow African Americans to stop agitating for social and political equality and focus instead on economic opportunities. White listeners gave him a standing ovation, but W.E.B. Du Bois and other black leaders denounced Washington for downplaying civil rights and submitting to segregation and inequality. Washington's speech set the stage for 2 different responses to the struggle for black political rights in the aftermath of Reconstruction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: continued agitation for social and political equality, or turning inward to build successful communities that emphasize self-reliance and black leadership.
In the decades following the Civil War, African Americans won and lost rights gained during Reconstruction. During that period, African Americans began reuniting their families separated during slavery, pursued formal education, and created their own institutions. Education, so long denied, became a top priority. In 1860, 90% of the adult Southern African American population were illiterate. Through their own efforts and with support from other institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau, illiteracy declined to 30% by 1910. By the end of the 19th century, Southern and Northern states had passed laws and supported customs that disenfranchised, terrorized, and forced African Americans to the margins of American public life. In the depths of segregation, African Americans turned inward to build their own institutions that became central to their social, economic, and political life. Institutions such as benevolent societies, churches, mutual aid clubs, and fraternal societies enabled African Americans to organize outside of the family, establish leadership, and receive fellowship and status. The church particularly thrived during this time. Tens of thousands of Southern African American Baptists, Presbyterians, and Methodists withdrew from predominantly white churches and founded their own denominations. Leaders from previous generations, born into slavery but who grew up in freedom, joined the first generation, born after emancipation, in embracing acts of self-determination and the philosophy of self-help. These were at the forefront of political activity amongst prominent African American literary artists, political leaders, preachers, professors, publishers, and other highly educated professionals who put their intellect and training in service to the race. Important spokespersons included Ida Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington, among others. These leaders used their experience and influence to tell the truth about themselves and their people. Much of the political activity amongst these race leaders and their contemporaries contributed to the founding of organizations like today's Tuskegee University in 1881, the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW, in 1896, and later the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, in 1909. Together, these organizations promoted race uplift, or the idea that African Americans themselves were responsible for their progress in the face of mounting oppression. Alonzo Herndon's life was proof that despite the limitations imposed by Jim Crow, Black Georgians could become dynamic entrepreneurs. Herndon began life enslaved in Walton County, Georgia in 1858. But at the age of 47, he started the company that became one of America's most successful Black-owned businesses. As a child, in the years following the Civil War, Herndon worked with his family as sharecroppers. But with just 1 year of formal education, he opened a barbershop in Jonesboro in 1878, then moved to Atlanta. By 1900, he owned 3 barbershops serving some of Atlanta's most elite white citizens. One, the elegant Crystal Palace, operated until 1972. The ambitious Herndon invested heavily in Auburn Avenue real estate, and in 1905, he paid $140 for a small burial association. It eventually became the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, which made him Atlanta's first Black millionaire. It had 23 offices in Georgia alone. He and his wife, Adrienne, an Atlanta University professor, built a 15-room mansion that still stands in Atlanta's Vine City neighborhood. The Atlanta Life Insurance Company remains one of the top Black financial institutions in America. And yet, despite his great success, Alonzo Herndon was not untouched by the racism and violence of his time. During the Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, Herndon's barbershop was attacked and vandalized. Fortunately, he had closed the shop early and therefore avoided the fate of fellow African American barbers in a shop across the street. They were killed by white rioters during the attacks. At the time of his death in 1927, Herndon was Atlanta's wealthiest Black citizen, owning more property than any other African American. Admired and respected, he was noted for his involvement in and support of local institutions and charities devoted to advancing African American business and community life. While he was most active in philanthropic work at home, Alonzo Herndon was an important figure in the national movement for African American advancement. He joined Booker T. Washington at the founding of the Negro Business League in Boston, and W.E.B. Du Bois at the founding of the Niagara Movement in 1905. Herndon's life and career laid the foundation for the Black leadership that would emerge in Atlanta later in the 20th century during the Great Civil Rights Revolution to come. So as you can see, the period of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age offered both great promise and great disappointment for many Georgians. It was a critical turning point in American history, and our state was really at the center of that story. We thank all of you for spending part of your day with us. We hope that you enjoyed this video and learned something new along the way about this important period in Georgia history.